It was developed by a Japanese doujin. Is it pronounced Siter Skain?
That's the way I understand it.
Okay, when I always read that, I always read that wrong. It's like Sister Skain. All of a sudden, start playing. What's that? What's that one? How much? What's your price for flight by? Is that the '80s song?
Oh, Sister Christian?
Sister Christian. That immediately starts playing whenever I read that, and unintentional things of playing maybe too much shmups and then stuff. This is your brain on shmups, people.
Shoot the core cast.
Welcome to Shoot the Corecast, official companion podcast of the RF Generation Shmup Club. This is a family-friendly shmup-themed podcast that doesn't often play God, but when we do, we play Kamui. From RF Generation, I am Addicted, and with me as always is...
MetalFRO, also known as Game Boy Guru.
So a quick little blurb about the RF Generation. Have a great database where you can document your collection. It has all sorts of different variations for stuff, so if you're looking for... let's say, hey, I want to add this Brazilian title to my collection that was released for the Mega Drive, you can definitely do so. Or a weird Korean variant. You're definitely going to be able to find stuff that's not normally shown in other game collecting apps. Also, a lot of articles on there, good stuff. And right now we're trying to finish our 2019 goal of beating every licensed Nintendo game.
Yes, and also a Discord server that you can come hang out with us and chat and have some fun there.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion going on right now about Darius, and specifically Darius Twin. We're all trying to get the high score and figure out the best path to the win.
Yep, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. By the way, everything at rfgeneration.com is free to use, and it is free to sign up, so go check it out, rfgeneration.com.
No cost to you, only to us. Alright, yes. So the shmup game of the month for September was Kamui, which is very similar to Taito's Ray Force. In fact, that is into our question of the month.
Yes.
Kamui borrows heavily from Taito's Ray Force in its design and gameplay. What game do you feel may stick too closely to its source of inspiration, even if it's a good game in its own right?
Yeah, so at Collector Cast, Duke Togo from the Collector Cast says, hard for me to think at the moment, but Life Force is way too gradius compared to Salamander, but it still plays great.
You forgot to say the heart and soul of the Collector Cast.
Well, I think most people will know that by now.
That's true. All right, our next one comes from @Maz67086804. Polestar, being made by ex-Irem devs, may feel like an R-Type series game. Force pod, stage, and enemy design gameplay, the R-Type vibes are really strong with this one. Yeah, yes. I really like Polestar, and I want to see if we can fit that in with the next couple of years. It's a great game.
Indeed. Yeah, we need to get a Neo Geo shooter in there somewhere. And finally, at Risk System _game says, it's tough to say because sometimes even genre conventions can make titles feel samey, and deviations tend to need to be incremental for audiences to not throw a fit, so even a game doing something new will often have to resemble a previous success to keep people comfortable. And that's an interesting perspective, and I think there's a lot of validity to that. For myself, I was kind of mulling over this question, trying to figure out, how to properly answer it. And of course, there are a lot of ways you can approach it. We'll be discussing Kamui here and all the similarities to Taito's Ray series. But then, as Risk System Game says, there's a lot of borrowing in the genre anyway, because if you think about Seibu Kaihatsu borrowed a lot from Twin Cobra or Kyoku Tiger when they made the original Raiden. And then the original Raiden became the source of many copycats. And so you had things like Sand Scorpion and, oh gosh, I can't remember the name of the Korean developer that did at least 2 blatant Raiden ripoffs. And, there's got to be a half a dozen games like that. So that's what I would say is maybe just the glut of Raiden clones that sort of came out in the early 90s, I would think are probably too far into that plagiarism space, even though, generally speaking, they're still fun to throw a few quarters into now and again. What about you?
As for me, I'm going to sort of stray away a little bit from shmups here and say Cannon Dancer and Gun Force 2. Or you could say more, if you want to be technically correct, say Metal Slug. Is Gun Force 2 Geostorm was made by the devs who would eventually, I'm sure the story is about as old as everybody knowing Doki Doki Panic is transformed into Super Mario Bros. 2 for the USA. But Gun Force 2 was made by Irem employees who would later on make the Metal Slug series. So it's very interesting to see the parallels there and how it's sort of like a pseudo prequel. It's really interesting. The other game that I would add on is Cannon Dancer. Have you heard of that before?
I think I've heard the name, but I'm not familiar with it.
It's one of the. It sort of falls along the same path. But Cannon Dancer is made by ex-Capcom devs, and if you were to Google it, you would say, that really looks like Strider. It's sort of like in some ways, it's like a Strider 1.5. They don't do that PS1, polygon 3D perspective, but it's still an interesting game to check out. Until the early 2000s was relatively unknown. So if you're looking for some MAME hidden gems, which, well, probably at this point aren't hidden gems, but if you're looking for some different games to try out on MAME, give them a shot.
Okay. Well, I'm sure it's probably better than Strider Returns.
I'm sure the AVGN would have some expletives to say about that game, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, that's to say I think everything is better than Strider Returns.
One thing I want to add in real quick is that Cannon Dancer also goes by the name Osman.
Okay, I have heard that as well. Good deal. So thank you for the handful of you who participated this month, and we'll hopefully have an interesting question to make you think next month.
All right, so you ready to get into Kamui?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so it was developed by a Japanese doujin. Is it pronounced Siter Skain?
That's the way I understand it.
Okay, when I always read that wrong. It's like Siter Skain. All of a sudden start playing. What's that one? What's your price for flight by, is that the 80s song?
Oh, Sister Christian?
Sister Christian. That immediately starts playing whenever I read that, and unintentional things of playing maybe too much shmups and then looking at stuff. This is your brain on shmups, people. All right. So it was developed by a Japanese doujin, Siter Skain, initially published by Himeya Soft in December 1999. It was published in the West by New Media on Steam 15 years later. Siter Skain had previously developed 2 games, notably a prototype STG called Reflection, which was later reworked into game Reflex X. Kamui and Reflex X make up 2/3 of the Tale of Altynex trilogy, along with the game Altynex Second. Now, Kamui was the first game in the trilogy to be released, though canonically, it's the final portion of the 3 games, or the third in the trilogy. Kamui is heavily inspired by Taito's Ray series of shooters, with gameplay often mirroring Ray Force, and the story having lots of similarities with Ray Crisis. Siter Skain is working on a new game, Heavy Dragoon Arms.
Something like that.
Yeah. It has an overhead mech action game similar style to Gunspike or Cannon Spike. No ETA on release yet. Well, If it's anything like Kamui, I will definitely be there.
Yeah.
So, would you like us to take us into the Tex-Mexium of the game, so to speak, or the story?
Sure. Taking place sometime after the events of Reflex, humanity continued to recover from the devastating war with the Raiwat. In an effort to improve AI and revolutionize computer systems, a top scientist named Zafikel de Alice created a questionable method by which to infuse the human brain with a powerful computer to create more effective weapons. The technique proved successful. In a strange twist of irony, his daughter Panafil de Alice was found to have supernatural powers. Zafikel was unable to hide this fact, and Panafil was chosen by the military as a test subject, and her brain transferred into an automated Kamui fighter. Devastated, Zafikel decided to take revenge on humanity and use the technique on himself, transferring his mind into the orbital control platform Adjudicator. He also rebuilt the supercomputer Altinex to aid him in his efforts. However, Altinex turned on him and took control of all of Earth's military forces, save for the single Kamui driven by Panafil. Now, this rogue Kamui must destroy both Altinex and Adjudicator before humanity is destroyed.
This story takes me back to memories of Thunder Force, really, with their stories where I think one of them was that the Voyager probe somehow became sentient and wanted to wipe out humanity. Was that the basis of Thunder Force 3? I'm trying but it went full craziness, and I love it.
No, that was Star Trek the Motion Picture.
I'm pretty sure one of them was a probe that it gained sentience, and it wasn't Star Trek the Motion Picture. It was definitely one of the Thunder Force series where it was just absolutely crazy. I'm pretty sure it was Thunder Force 3. Well, speaking of which, we'll have to get back to that to see how fun that story is.
Yeah. And of course, just a side note to make sure that this is clear is that Altinex is a supercomputer planetary defense system, and defeating that is part of your mission, very similar to the Con-Human computer from Ray Crisis.
Now, we talked about Kamui, mentioned it several times. Do you want to describe what Kamui is?
Yeah. It's a vertical scrolling shoot 'em up. It's 2 action buttons. And basically the way it works is you have one button that is your primary forward fire, and then you have a second button that activates a lock-on mechanism. Very similar to Ray Force, Ray Storm, or Ray Crisis, or also, coincidentally enough, Terra Diver, or Tsukio Gorentai. So it was kind of, I don't know if it was just something in the water during that time in mid to late 90s Japan, but there was definitely several games coming out that had this lock-on mechanic as part of its main draw. And so the lock-on mechanic is essentially what's called a lightning weapon. And with Ray Force, of course, or things like Dragon Spirit or Xevious, games that it draws inspiration from, you've got a target reticle that's out in front of your ship. And so when enemies pass underneath of that, that's when you can target them and then fire. Well, with Kamui, it's a little bit different because essentially the entire size of the screen is your target area. And so it's just a matter of A, making sure that you have energy to target, and there's a meter at the bottom of the screen that fills up. And then B, enemies that are on a lower plane below kind of your level there at the, in the stage. And so you hold down the second action button to use that and target enemies, and then release to actually fire the lightning weapon.
Yeah, it's a lot of balancing your resources on this. You're going to be, if you're going to be hitting enemies below you, then you're going to be hitting enemies on top. And if you hold down both buttons, you end up doing a focus shot. But the focus shot, that means that you can't hit enemies on the lower plane. So there's it's a balancing act between the three, which makes it quite challenging, but I think it also makes it quite good.
Right. And yeah, that lightning laser that you get when you activate both buttons, it's only good for a certain amount of time based on the amount of energy that's in the meter, and that depletes pretty quickly.
Right. The lightning meter pushes the other meter back. It's like a needle that's you want to try and keep in the middle as much as possible. As if you press down the focus shot, it takes away from your lightning meter. If you want to lightning meter, you're not going to be able to do the focus shot as much.
Right.
I think you can cut that. I think I just said
that. Right. One of the big benefit of the lightning laser when you're activating it with both buttons is that not only does it do heavy damage, but it will also knock down almost any kind of enemy fire. So in lieu of having bombs or something like that in the game that will allow you to sort of screen clear and that sort of thing, you have the lightning laser. And so one of the techniques in the game is to sort of do short bursts of lightning laser. Hold down
activate the lightning force.
Something something like that. But yeah, like hold down your main fire button as you're shooting away at enemies, and then sort of tap and just briefly, and I mean briefly, hold down the lightning button so that you'll activate that lightning laser for just a little bit, and you can cut a swath through a whole mess of enemy bullets and make a path for yourself. Or, do that kind of at the last second as enemy fire is coming your direction so that you're not taking hits. It's a major strategic component of playing this game, and, gives you the ability to, I'm not going to say like a get out of jail free card, but it certainly allows you a lot of flexibility in terms of getting out of precarious situations and finding a way to deal with a situation where you may be otherwise overwhelmed with bullets and enemy fire. So, yeah, it's interesting that way. The other thing that's interesting is the lightning weapon just by itself. As you're going through the level and you're using it, once you've used the lightning weapon, it will charge on its own. But one of the interesting things is if you hold the button down to prepare a charge to release so that you can target and shoot enemies on a lower plane, it actually charges faster while you're holding the button. But even with that, the charging slows as it gets to the top, or as the meter fills up, so that you've got a little bit of a delay there before it actually fully charges. And that factors into scoring, which we'll talk about a little bit later, because the lock-on lightning weapon portion of the game is really where the scoring is more robust. Now, the game does play out over what I'll call 5 main stages. The first 4 have you approaching the Altai-Nex defense system. Stage 5 is attack on Altai-Nex. And then stage 6 is literally just the final boss fight against Zafikel and the Adjudicator. So, and of course, stage 5, with the attack on Altai-Nex, there's not really much of a stage to speak of. So it's almost like 4 main stages and then 2 big boss fights. So it's kind of interesting that it's structured that way. But, yeah, that's pretty much how the game plays out. And one of the other main differences between Kamui and a lot of the games that it takes inspiration from is your ship is not quite a glass cannon in the same way that a lot of other shmup ships tend to be. Most every game like that is your one-hit deaths. Well, in Kamui, you actually have a shield system. So when you start out the game, your ship has 4 shield hits that you can take. And then once you've depleted all your shield hits, of course, you lose a ship, and then the next one is deployed. It is instant respawn, and once again, you start with 4 shield hits. So it's an interesting approach, and I think it was probably smart for the developers to, or for Siter Skain to do that, because the way that the game is structured, the amount of stuff that's thrown at you, even though the ship has what I would call a reasonable hitbox, there's so much being thrown at you at all times, or seemingly at all times, especially with some of the boss fights, that I really feel like it was probably a smart decision to go with a shield system instead of straight lives. Because I think, wow, I've seen playthroughs on YouTube of people who have been able to play through it and like no hit. And I mean no hit as in not even taking any shield hits. But wow, that's a tall order. Because this game is difficult, even on the standard difficulty level. But helping you out along the way, of course, is power-ups that you can get to power up your main cannon. And then also, every once in a while, you can trigger a shield restore, which will give you back 1 shield hit. So I think your ship can hold a maximum of 8 shield hits. And so it's weird that you start with 4, and then you can build up more than that. But yeah, that's Kamui in a nutshell.
Yeah, I would have to say, echo those sentiments that Kamui is definitely a more difficult game than I had initially anticipated, just because of the amount of constant juggling that you have to do between the 3 systems. It's not impossible, it's just something that is going to require a good chunk of time investment into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things where, like any shmup, or like any game that's really worth putting the time into, it's one that you'll see dividends with as you put time into it, and you'll have those aha moments of sort of figuring out when and where to use the lightning laser, and when and how frequently to use the lightning weapon to target enemies below. And then you'll start to see, you'll start to get a feel for the flow of the game, and as far as like how much of the lock-on do you need to use, and then once you kind of get into the scoring of the game, it is when do you use the lock-on versus the regular weapon, because there are some enemies that will either start below and come up to your level so that you can target them before they get up there, or will start on your level, and then if you let them time out, they'll go down and you can maybe target them. So it's a balancing act of damage them some before they time out, so that when you lock on, you can get a lock-on kill and hopefully get that extra point value for scoring. But I think also, I don't know, it's an interesting dance, like you said, kind of going back and forth between utilizing the regular forward shot, the lightning weapon, and the lightning laser. And so I think that sort of 3-way push-pull works really well with the game, and I do think it is rewarding as you play it over time and sort of get used to how the game works. Just to sort of have those small victories and, oh, I got a little farther, and that sort of thing. I mean, when I booted the game up just before the beginning of the month to kind of play it a little bit and find a little bit of time to sort of get used to the controls again and remember what it was that, is the basic way to play, so that I didn't embarrass myself on my first stream. It took me a little bit to kind of get used to it again, and I was kind of taken aback. I kind of thought to myself, this is harder than I remember, and how am I going to get anywhere in this game during the course of the month? But it's been years since I played this game, and put any real time into it other than, just a few minutes or whatever. So for me, it was kind of an experience of kind of getting back into that groove and relearning how to sort of think in that direction or in that manner to sort of understand when and where to use the lock-on, when and where to use the lightning laser, and how to balance those things with your standard forward shot, knowing when is it appropriate to dodge versus using bursts of your lightning laser, because either you can't dodge or you just can't dodge successfully. And so in a game where you would normally throw a bomb, this gives you a lot more flexibility to get out of some of those hairy situations without expending too much in the way of resources. So it's a much different and interesting take on that idea, making a screen clearing or partially screen clearing type of attack be a much more readily available and renewable type of resource than your typical bombs. I know in games like the Rising games like Battle Garega and Battle Backraid and Armed Police Batrider, you collect these little bomb icons and things like that to sort of collect these up, and then once you get so many, you build up your bomb stock. And as you destroy enemies throughout the game, you can collect these things left and right. And so there's a way to effectively build up a very large bomb stock so that you have those available to use. Now, of course, in Garega and in those games, there's a lot that you can do with those in terms of scoring, but just in terms of sheer survivability, if you can manage to collect a lot of those, you can have a pretty hefty bomb stock. And there are some other shooters that do that too. But in this game, you're not dependent on collecting anything to do that. It's literally just allowing the meter to recharge a little bit so that you can use a burst of that and give yourself a path forward. And I don't know, I think that's a really interesting approach, and I'm surprised that there aren't more developers who have tapped into that idea.
I would say that your closest developer in that case will probably be with Blue Revolver, is you have your regular shot, you have your focus, and then you have your little special that you have to collect stuff in order to actually activate. It's not quite a meter, but that's the doujin space again is when you're getting closest to this. Your standard cave game, well, it has a third button. Most people aren't going to use the bomb in that case, and I've been playing a lot of Futari lately, and it's pretty much a 2-button game. You have your rapid shot, and then you switch back to your focus shot, your rapid shot, and you do the 1-2 dance. Well, this is a 1-2-3 dance, and I could definitely see it become a 1-2-3-4 dance before this is over. And it's always interesting. We talked about this earlier with how close do you keep it to the tried and true while experimenting enough so that people recognize it and the mechanics in there aren't afraid to try it, but provide enough of a variation that it seems new and interesting.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance. And, I know we kind of joked throughout the course of the month that this game sort of plagiarizes the Ray series from Taito. And in some ways it does. We can get into some of how it does that, but it also does enough that takes those ideas and expands upon them or takes them in a different direction to where I think it does sort of strike out its own identity, particularly in not needing to actually target enemies with a reticle, but just being able to literally activate the weapon, and anything that's on screen, you can hit with a lightning laser.
I think that, to your point on that is something that is hard to get across initially, is it targeting that initial plane and figuring out when is an enemy on the lower plane versus when is the enemy on the standard plane, what can I hit and what I can't, is one of the biggest learning curves this game has.
Yeah, I mean, it's, unless you go in already knowing the mechanics and having watched playthroughs and things like that, if you go into this game cold, it's going to take you a few playthroughs to really get a feel for it and kind of get a rhythm with how you need to deploy the lightning laser and the lightning weapon, and kind of sort of understand when those things are most appropriate situationally, so that you can kind of start to figure out your way through the levels. And I know that there are a lot of shooters that are similar in the sense that, you know, you have to learn how best to utilize the tools that you're given. But like I say, this is different in the sense that what would be your screen clearing device is not a limited resource, or it's not very limited. So you really do have a lot more flexibility than you will in other games, where the way that you play it or the way that you kind of route through a stage and that is very rigid. And it probably is in this game in the sense of, if you want to maximize your score, there's probably a certain way to approach it. But in terms of strictly survival, there's a lot you can do in order to kind of figure your way through the game and sort of help to tweak it a little bit every time, so you get a little bit farther, a little bit further, a little bit further, and really just keep progressing little bit by little bit and refining that dance between the three weapon types.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of Doom. When Doom first came out, all you had to worry about was that one plane, what was right in front of you. As you just pressed the button and shot, you didn't have to worry about what was above you or below you. And then when you started to deal with having to look up, look down, and shoot there, it definitely changed the dynamics of a game and made it, in my opinion, more of an interesting game. But it still retained that feel of what they were called at the time Doom clones, or first-person shooters. So it's interesting to see some of the parallels that with the first-person shooters and with the evolution of shmups and the ideas that were borrowed and then iterated upon.
Yeah.
So we've got a opinion. I want to circle around a little bit back to the sound here. The sound effects, the sound overall was decent, but nothing that made me really want to stick it inside my boombox or stereo or anything and just listen to it outside. It wasn't serviceable but unremarkable is how I would describe this. I do have to say that the explosions were nice and crunchy and didn't have that, they had the snap, crackle, pop that you expect, and you don't always get with a doujin game. Sometimes they're overblown, or it just doesn't sound right, and it's really nice to see that they nailed it for these. And again, the music was serviceable, and I didn't have any problems where I wanted to turn it off and put on some Slayer or Witchfinder General, whatever have you. But it's it wasn't bad enough that I wanted to turn it off, but it wasn't good enough that I wanted to turn it up.
Yeah, that's one of the things that kind of struck me as I was playing the game. I remember the game having a solid soundtrack when I played it years ago, but I never remembered any of the tracks. And when I went back to it and was streaming it through the course of the month, a lot of the tunes kind of came back, and I sort of, the melodies kind of got into my head a little bit. But when I stopped playing the game, the music doesn't continue to play in my head, and it's not something that I'm remembering consistently after I quit playing. So I don't know. I think the music is strong, but it's not overly strong, if that makes sense. It, like you said, serviceable, but I think it's maybe a little bit better than that. It's just not, it's not enough that it left a mark for me.
Well, to me, it blew the socks off of 1942 soundtrack.
Well, I think almost everything blows the socks off 1942, but I definitely enjoyed the tunes, and I think they fit the game well. I just don't think most of what's in the game is that memorable. I do think the boss theme, maybe, is a little bit more memorable than the rest, but that may also be because you hear it more frequently when you're playing through the game. So, I don't know. One of the things that I noticed that I thought was kind of cool is that the game has 2 different versions of the soundtrack. Given the fact that this originally came out in 1999, it has both a MIDI and an Ogg Vorbis version of the soundtrack.
Yeah, fire up your Roland. Let's go.
The Ogg Vorbis thing, I was surprised by because that was a relatively new-ish format around that time. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Probably, I don't know this for sure, don't quote me on this, but that may be an open source format, whereas MP3 at the time was still a licensed deal, because I think it was maybe a couple years yet before we would get the layman coder. And so I think it was still like a German sound engineer or something like that who came up with MP3 as a format. So anyway, that was a neat detail that I thought. One of the things that we have to talk about is the graphics and how much Kamui borrows from the Ray series, particularly from Ray Force. I mean, the Kamui spaceship itself is, I won't say a clone, but if you put them side by side, it looks awful close to the ship from Ray Force, the RVA 818X Lay ship. And then, of course, there are other things that it borrows as well. You know, the sprite scaling that is common in Ray Force is a big element in Kamui. Your ship sort of drops into the stage like Ray Force, and you have, because of the whole multiple planes thing, you've got ships coming in from the top, scaling down to your level, or you've got ships at your level that scale downward, or stuff that comes up from a lower plane and scales up to your level. There's a lot of that going on. You have things like, well, in the first stage, you've got those girders or whatever that you're flying through, sort of like in a space station, that fly over top of you to sort of briefly obscure the Kamui ship. That's a thing that you see.
That was another Star Trek reference right there. Those girders on there? No.
But, I mean, you see that in Ray Force. And then, of course, the lightning weapon is not unlike the lightning lock-on weapon of the Argray 02 fighter in Raystorm. So there's so much that they borrow from Ray Force and the related games. And I mean, I know that this is kind of coming out about the same time, because Ray Force came out in 94, and then Raystorm in 96, and Ray Crisis in 98. So that was pretty fresh yet when Kamui was released just a year or so later.
Yeah, I think nowadays they would use the term spiritual sequel, homage, right. Yeah, stuff, and those words instead of clone. It's interesting to see how it does more than just change enough to be not called a copyright infringement. It is its own thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's at the time that this came out, I think an argument could have been made that this is the great Gianna sisters to Ray Force's Super Mario Brothers. But as we've kind of discussed, there's enough in the game's design that sort of sets it apart or makes it more unique so that it's not just a direct clone. You know, it's got a little bit of its own flavor to it. And I think just enough that you can say that it has its own thing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that assessment. Enough of the pieces have been changed that it still feels the core gameplay loop is still very similar to Ray Force, but that makes it familiar, and it allows you to focus on the deviations from it and experience what's new. It walks a fine line, just like Johnny Cash, and it does a good job.
Yes.
So, speaking of walking the fine line here, I could only make it up to the stage 3 boss before I had to give up on my dreams of 1cc. Was there anything memorable about the game that stood out for you? Maybe an enemy, a boss, or something in there?
Well, the stage 3 boss in particular is quite memorable. because it's very difficult and it has multiple phases. So it has a lot going on. It's also takes a while to learn. That's one of the things that I didn't quite learn a foolproof way to kind of get through that boss, because some of the attacks are quite devious, and they do things like multiple attack vectors. So it'll spray all of these spinning yellow bullets at you. Things that D-Tungsten during the course of the month on my streams was calling it orzo. But so it'll do that. It'll have these sort of spreads of the yellow spinning orzo, we'll call it, while also then shooting out homing lasers. So it's a matter of figuring out, okay, so how much do I conserve my lightning laser meter so that I can kind of use that to burst fire through that to clear the path so that I can not take shield hits during that time. And there are other, it even has melee attacks where it has, because it sort of looks like a crab, kind of a robot crab thing. And so it has this melee attack where it does a sort of thing where it lunges these two arms out at you one at a time, and then follows that up with a laser volley. And then there's another attack where it sort of brings in those arms while it's shooting out lasers from those arms and its two forward laser cannons, where you have to fly up and over top of the boss briefly so that you can target it, but also avoid those lasers, because that's the only way to avoid them. So there's a lot going on with that boss, and it's a very cool and memorable, yet sometimes very frustrating fight. So definitely something that was well thought out and well constructed, as is the Zafikel fight at the end of the game, where you're fighting against the Adjudicator. There are even more phases in that fight, and there's so much going on with it that I do feel like it would take quite a while to properly learn how to take on that final boss fight and really master it. The one thing that the game offers, which I think was probably relatively innovative for its time, is it has a training mode. So you have the ability to go in and select each stage and practice each stage one at a time. It's a little rudimentary. You're going into those fights with the base power, so you don't have the full power that you would have by collecting power-ups throughout the course of the game, and making your forward fire stronger. But it is a way to sort of learn the level layouts, enemy patterns, and placements, and things like that. And so I did find it useful. I sort of worked my way up to stage 3, got to the point where I could sort of consistently beat the stage 3 boss, and then I started working on stage 4 practice, and I grinded on stage 4 for about a week, and got to the point where I could almost take down the stage 4 boss, and I think I might have done so once or twice. So then I went back and started doing some full runs, and was able to do a couple of times where I could get all the way through stage 3, including the boss, get into stage 4, and at least get part of the way through, if not reach the boss by the time, we got to the end of the month.
I would have to say, I definitely agree with your assessments. I would also have to add in stage 3, the boss really surprised me in the way that it tried to box the player in and start doing its own focus shots. But the most surprising part had to be at the end, where the boss tries to do one last desperate attempt to try and kill Kamui. I'd never seen a sort of like a death shot before within this shmup.
Oh.
You know how in Castlevania with Dracula X, it became this cool thing where the boss would always try and finish you off at the end, but it never could. Always left you with like a sliver of health. it has the same vibe of it, and like, hey, I'm about to die, I'm going to use my focus shot and try and kill you at the very, and that struck me as something new and interesting I hadn't seen before.
Right.
Also, this is as you mentioned, 1999. This was, M2 was founded in 91, and it would still be a couple years yet before they showed everybody how to properly do a training mode.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, the fact that it's even there at all is quite an achievement, and I'm pretty sure that the training mode is in the original doujin version, because I still have a copy of that kicking around somewhere. You know, I've got the Steam version, of course, but I downloaded and played this game years ago, and I seem to remember that being a part of the game, you know, in earlier incarnations. I don't think it was just added for the Steam release.
I do want to add one quick thing here. I had to look this up because I'm quite interested in, apparently there must have been something in the water, is about you said it was very Star Trek, the motion picture for the Voyager probe, and yes, you are right on that, but I was looking through the ending story for Thunder Force 3, and spoiler alerts for anyone here who hasn't beaten it, it said the Emperor Orn had been disturbing the union of the Milky Way for a long time. What was his true character? It was a huge biocomputer which had been made in the beginning of the space age. So and then we have Phantasy Star 2, which came out in 91, that had the sort of the space age computer taking over everything. So I think it was just something about the 90s that made people think about space age computers.
Yeah, I guess when the more technology becomes a part of our life, the more, you know, it makes you think about how far is too far. And I mean, you know, we're at a point now, and this is 20 years on from something like Kamui coming out, and almost 30 years on from something like Phantasy Star 2. Or actually, yeah, 30 years on from Phantasy Star 2, where you look at this and you think, well, when do we get to the point where, you know, we have, what's the word I'm looking for? When do we get to the point where we have malevolent AI? Or, you know, when do we reach Skynet kind of thing?
I'm calling it here right now, 2025, the first shmup where you have to defeat Siri and a giant iPhone for the end of the game.
You heard it here first, folks. I mean, yeah, it's interesting to think about. You know, I try not to dwell on it too much because I don't know how likely it is, but it is interesting to consider and at least, you know, think about how much technology rules our lives these days, and how much we depend on it as well.
Yeah, even more so by this year, which we won't get into, but man, yeah, it's impressive and scary at the same time. One of the things I will have to touch upon that is most impressive by this game is even with all the bullets going on and everything that was playing through, I didn't have any problem where I felt cheated. I was always like, okay, I could have done this, or that there was nothing that bullets that came out of nowhere that I couldn't see, nothing melded in. The color palette was really nice and allowed me to visually distinguish where I was versus all the enemies and all the bullets that were going on at any given time.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think the design of the game is such that things are relatively clear. You know, you're not having one of those moments like we had with Ghost Blade where the orange bullets against that sort of red and pink background did not do it any favors, or you know, that kind of a thing. So I do think that it visually is distinct enough that it was able to, yeah, you're able to see everything and you're not blindsided most of the time.
Yeah, I just get this picture of putting bullets that blend in with the backgrounds is like creating a aluminum pinball game. You know, a person, where's the ball? I don't know. Everything's shiny.
Right.
All right. Well, now that we've given our impressions, let's move on to impressions from the forums. First one comes to us from Zordo. Hey guys, as this is another one of the La Cia games I'm in. When I saw you picked it for September, I just had to try a few runs and try and focus more on it this month. I just played a run and beat my former score. I submitted for the tournament. The way the lock-on in Laser works is still a bit confusing to other lock-on shooters like Rayforce or Crimson Clover, but I'm getting used to it. I managed to break 7 million finally. Still couldn't beat the Stage 3 boss. It's ridiculously hard. No doubt about it. Congratulations on breaking your 7 mil score.
Indeed. And Geriatric Danmaku says, "Hello, shmup players. I'm attempting to join in on the fun, but for now, only in the geriatric division, which is my excuse for playing on easy, and not that well yet. The entries under the name Smack have been registered at various times over the last 3 years. The entries under the name GDM are registered during the current month." So that's in reference to the picture he posted in the thread there with his scores. "My current goal is to get a new PB during this month. Any 50-plus aged players want to take a shot at me? Bring it!" And then in parentheses it says, "Please don't actually bring it. Not up for that level of competition." And then he offered some final thoughts at the end of the month and says, "Kamui made me start to feel really old. It's just a lot of activity to keep up with. Eventually, playing it made me feel stressed out. Kamui is such a professional production, it's hard to think of as a doujin title. I used anti-micro button mapping software to map the pressing of both buttons to just one, which made things a little easier to manage. If you are feeling that your current shmup is not stressing your brain enough, try out Kamui." And I'll have to say that that button mapping is a smart idea. I didn't do that during the course of the month, but that's not a bad approach. Looking at the high scores, since there was only the 4 of us that participated, you, me, Zoido, and Geriatric Danmaku, we only had the 3 submissions.
Everybody's a winner.
Yeah. So I ended up taking the top spot with 13,827,150, which I was very pleased with. That was one of the last runs I did during the course of the month, getting all the way into stage 4 on a single credit. Zoido with his 7,139,920 points, and Geriatric Danmaku, as mentioned before, with 4,356,020 points.
Congrats to everybody, and thank you for joining us.
Yes, it was a small crowd this time, but we appreciate you guys playing along.
And that's usually what happens with some of the indie doujin releases of the PC shmups or STGs. We get less of a player base, but the player base is more dedicated, which is fine. It's something we like to alternate to, because it really is one of the seminal doujin releases, and right up there with Crimson Clover, and I would have to say Zero Ranger in that same company. And something that people should be looking out for. And I think, was it last year that these were all on sale for Humble Bundle for like $5 or something? It's something ridiculously cheap. And I think it's something that you definitely should pick up on a Steam sale and see if it's right for you. It's not going to be the best shmup ever, but what it is certainly worth playing.
Yeah, and despite the fact that it borrows a little bit too heavily sometimes from Taito's Ray series and doesn't do, that it's using a lot of existing ideas, it does just enough with those ideas that's different from what's been done before to make it distinct and to be a unique experience. So I definitely think Kamui is worth a play, and realistically, yeah, like you said, the Tale of Altai-Nex trilogy goes on sale pretty frequently on Steam, and it has been featured in a Humble Bundle at one point, so it can often be picked up very inexpensively, and all 3 of the games are definitely worth a play.
Well said. So as we look towards here, we're recording this in early October, and we're going to switch from giant enemy crabs to a full seafood buffet with Darius Twin for October. It's great for the Super Famicom, and for those of you who have recently picked up the Darius collection, come on and join us.
Yeah, break out the tartar sauce.
Indeed. and in November, we're getting ready to go multiplayer with the Pilgrims with Jamestown Plus. I fully expect to see Sarah streaming this. This is one of those great... if you're looking for a way to bring everybody in the family virtually together during Thanksgiving or during the holidays, bring them in with Jamestown.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, and that's available on PC, PS4, and Switch. So there are plenty of ways to play.
All right. We'd like to thank Sarah Flash of Studio Mudprint / Bullet Heaven for the logo and the frequent wearing of a great orange shirt. I'd like to also thank Kogasu for the intro and outro music, everybody on RFGen and the RFGen Playcast, everybody who is still working away at the 2019 RFGen NES Challenge. I'd like to thank MetalFRO for streaming the game of the month and making things always interesting with his two dogs.
Yes.
I'd like to thank Den T4F for running the La C Calice Cup series of competitions.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I wanted to mention is that he's been running these competitions, and of course it's a much more intense configuration or setup than what we have. We take a whole month to play a game, and this is one of those things where you get just a few short weeks to post a score in a dozen or so games. But both Zero Ranger and Kamui were on the list for the La Calice special that he ran here within the last few weeks. And so it's kind of fun to see people posting scores and posting runs and things like that from these two games, even though those individuals weren't specifically participating in our RF Generation Shmup Club. It was still neat to kind of see activity with those games and see the community playing and actively supporting those games.
And last but not least, I'd like to thank Mark MSX, who is running his own competition, Shmup Slam 3, and it's coming in November 7th and 8th. He's definitely one to watch. He always seems to have his finger on the pulse of the doujins. I don't know how he does it, but he always seems to know about a new game and have reviewed it by the time I'm just learning about it.
Yeah, and there should be several really fun live demonstrations coming up for Shmup Slam 3. I don't think the schedule's been posted yet, so, as of this recording, by the time this episode comes out, it'll be a little less than a month away, but definitely be watching out for that. So if you'd like to connect with us, just so you know, we're on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, and we are now on Amazon Music. So lots of ways that you can listen and enjoy the podcast, as always. And, of course, you can also check us out directly at rfgeneration.com and stream the episode there, or download it later and play it on your choice of device. You can follow us on Twitter at ShootCoreCast. We are over 800 followers now, so thank you to all of the new folks on Twitter who've been following the podcast. And you can also follow me directly at GameBoyGuru to see stream announcements and things like that. Join rfgeneration.com. Again, it is free. And come on over to the Community Playthroughs forum so that you can join in a Shmup Club playthrough. Also, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your preferred platform. If you provide us a good review and we get that across our feed, we will shout you out in an episode. Also, join the RF Generation Discord channel and check out the dedicated Shoot the Corecast topic there, where you can discuss the Shmup Club Game of the Month, the podcast episode, or even just shmups in general. And also follow me on Twitch to get notifications of new streams. That is twitch.tv/GuruGameBoy.
Yep, and in November it's going to be huge because every other notification is going to say playing Age of Calamity.
Yeah, it might, because I'm probably going to be getting Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity and spending a lot of time with that.
Looking forward to it.
So one other thing that I wanted to bring up here before we close out is, like this year, what we did in January with having Ketsui and having that be our year-long scoring competition, is that we're going to be doing the same thing next year. So in January, we're just going to let the cat out of the bag now so that people can get a copy of the game and be prepared. Our January game, that will be our 2021 scoring competition game, will be Battle Garega by Rising. And of course, you can purchase the PS4 port by M2. There was a physical release that came out in Korea, and that has been pressed multiple times, so should still be available. It can be purchased digitally on the Japanese and North American PSN. And of course, there's always the Saturn version. If you want to spend a lot of money, you can emulate the game. And if you're also crazy like I am, you may also have purchased the limited edition from Limited Run Games, and spent way more money on it than any human should spend on a video game. So anyway, Battle Garega will be our January 2021 game, and that will be our scoring competition for the year. And I guess to dovetail on that, you can still submit scores for Ketsui through the end of 2020. So if you've been working on the game or playing it and you feel like, hey, I should submit a score, maybe I'll be on the leaderboard, either go to the rfgeneration.com thread for Ketsui and submit your score there, or tweet at the Shoot Corecast account on Twitter with the hashtag RFGShmupClub and get us a screenshot or a photo showing your score, and we'll make sure to get you on the leaderboard.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that. Although the podcast may be like 5 hours of us learning strategies from Mark.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting one, because there's so much to talk about with Battle Garega. It's like an onion. It's so layered.
And it makes you cry.
Yes. Well, anything else that we need to touch on before we get out of here?
I'd like to thank everyone who participates along with us and tries out these games. It's been a lot of fun. I've been, playing shmups now with everybody here for a couple years, and it definitely makes a great way to go through the interesting year that 2020 has been and get some really good enjoyment playing out with other people, as well as trying new genres and getting better at different types. When I started out, I was more of a classic STG person. I preferred R-Type. However, I've been playing a lot more like Ketsui, or dealing a lot more with Futari, getting used to the bullet hell style games on there. I even recently branched out and tried some Toho. There's a lot going on with the community. I love everything I'm seeing, how it's picking up. And it seems like every other day there's a new shmup that someone's making. Mark used to say that the Xbox 360 era marked the renaissance, but I think we're living in a new renaissance of STGs, and I'm really happy to be a part of it and to be able to try all these excellent games and ideas that people are coming up with. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I really do think you're right. I think we are in a shmup renaissance, and I wrote about that at RFGen a couple years ago, and I just think it just continues to go up and up. So I'm excited for the future of the genre.
Definitely.
All right, well, that will do it for us here on this episode. So we will see you again next month.
Take care and stay safe.